We all know that we're heading towards a biorevolution for humanity. Gene editing, designer babies, 100-year plus lifespans for all, and who knows what else is coming our way. There's a lot of promise there, but there's also a lot of risk if we happen to get it wrong. How do we know where to go? Or better yet, how can we even get a handle on the long-term future for humanity? This week's guest, Jane Metcalfe, has a front row seat to this bioscience revolution as the founder and editor of Neo-Life. She's going to share her experiences working at the leading edge of the future, first with the digital revolution as founder of Wired magazine, and now on the leading edge of the biorevolution. Hey, but before we get started, be sure and click on the like button below, and please subscribe and click the alert button so you get notified anytime we post new content. Also, please do visit us at patreon.com/boldlynow to get exclusive and behind-the-scenes stories on the generative future. Okay, now on with the show.
Burning desire. Big ideas. Bold action.
Hi, it's Michael Sean Conaway, and I want to welcome you to today's Generative Conversation. These conversations are aimed at opening up the space of thinking and dialogue about the future of humanity. The things that we speak about and deal with in these conversations are less in the world of certainty or predicting what a future is going to have, but much more in the world of conversation, inquiry, and hopefully giving us the ability to generate a future that would be desirable for humanity, one that could allow for thriving. Today, I want to welcome Jane Metcalfe to the conversation. Jane is a dear friend. She's the founder of Wired magazine and helped to, if you would, invent the future of the computer age with that magazine, at least reflect on it and be a co-participant in that. And then most recently, she has founded another publication called Neo-Life, which is tracking all of the new inventions and new emerging technologies and emerging thoughts about our physical form, about our biological life, and how that is really entering into an age of explosive growth, which has fundamental impacts on what it means to be a human being. Jane, welcome to this conversation.
Hi, Michael Sean. It's great to see you.
Yeah. I in a way, when I think of like my journey as a futurist, it's so entangled with the era of Wired magazine. I can remember, some of the early issues that we got in the 90s, and this feeling that the conversation we were having was a new conversation, and that the relationship and understanding a relationship of our technological world and what we were creating and inventing as artists and writers and designers was really being featured by you guys. And so for me, like, I can't untangle the beginning of my career from Wired magazine. I feel like it was an expression at the time of who I was. Did you feel in that time that you were? Did you feel that you had your hand on the pulse of some kind of future, or is that just my recollection of it?
Oh, gosh, no. Absolutely. I mean, we were in Amsterdam publishing a magazine on behalf of a company that did translation services and also software for translators. And it was this little, publication in a very, very niche space, but because it was ultimately dealing with how machines and humans communicate with each other, and we were looking into things like machine translation and neural networks and sort of, how to preserve ambiguity as you move in and out of one language. We were looking at Esperanto as like an interlingua. I mean, it's all this like crazy out there stuff. But again, it just felt, cognitive linguistics is a very specific thing. And Lewis, my partner, went to Macworld in San Francisco and, came back with the first copy of PageMaker. Mm-hmm. And, the whole desktop publishing revolution was just kicking off at that point. And, he was in Silicon Valley talking to the engineers who were developing these types of tools. And, it's just, everybody's imaginations were just going wild. And what happens when people have the power to, publish their own, their own ideas? And, desktop publishing seems so trivial today. And yet at the time it was, it was the beginning of social media in a sense. It was like the biggest thing, to come down the pike since the invention of the personal computer. And it was really what drove the personal computer. I mean, that of course, and sex apps and so forth. I remember we ran a story in Wired, and the headline was, sex is the killer app that drives all technology. And that was a fresh idea back at the time. But anyway, no, we were absolutely taken by the vision of all these engineers and computer scientists that we were meeting, and touched by the humanity that they brought to their work and the sense of mission that they had. And, this idea that they were developing tools for creative people that would unleash, untold human imagination, creativity, and ingenuity. And, it was a sizzling time to be alive and to be there. And, there were just extraordinary people, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and, Alan Kay, who's been thinking about how technology and education can be used to unlock human potential. There were just theorists of all stripes around. And so, yeah, we were very conscious of it. We were, it was one of those moments where it's funny too, because I'm like the very tail end of the baby boom generation, sometimes also known as Gen X. But everywhere I went up until that point in my life, everybody would say, oh yeah, it's cool now, but you should have been here 10 years ago, and we had this very distinct feeling of being right here, right now, at the dawn of a new civilization.
Yeah, I remember we'd go to conferences and we'd be talking about, because our whole thing was, gaming and interactive media, interactive storytelling. And there are still projects that we invented that still haven't been realized today, that are still ahead of their time. And that was in the late 90s. I think when I think of you guys, though, I don't just think of technology. I think of great writing. And I also think of not only great design, but boundary pushing design. I mean, in a way, Wired magazine was at a certain point a style guide, if you will, and not only like an assault. Like it was like that. There was not going to be. We're not going to leave you without being changed or altered by the physical presence of the magazine. And so, how did you go from computer scientist to artist and visionary artist in a magazine? It seems like an improbable combination to me.
Well, the interesting thing is, Lewis didn't start out as a computer scientist at all. In fact, is not a computer scientist, although I can't tell you how much time he spends, tinkering with technology. But he's not a programmer at all. Never was, never will be. And his father was an engineer, and they grew up. His father was constantly building the house. The house actually never got finished. Man died 60 years later, never quite finished the house. So that tells you something. But but it was the idea of reverse engineering things and do it yourself, and figure it out as you go, that whole kind of mentality Lewis certainly brought to the project. But he was a writer. He was a creative writer. He published a magazine when he was a student at Columbia. I could show you. It's just right down the hall here. But he was a political thinker and published a magazine on like radical ways of thinking about things. That ultimately landed him on the cover of the New York Times Sunday magazine, as the originator of new political thought. But so he was, and of course, his father invented typesetting. His father was one of the engineers. His father did amazing work, kind of at the forefront of all the key technologies of the 20th century. And so, Lewis already understood type and page layout. He himself is very creative, has tremendous design talents and instincts and architect. He's a better architect. I've seen him argue with the architects that we've worked with in the past over the roof lines. He's like, no, you're going to create a problem. And the architect will stare at it and go, oh, you're right. But then, of course, we partnered with John Plunkett and Barbara Coor, who are extraordinary designers and creative thinkers. And, I think the collaboration and the intersection of ideas was just combustion. And, John would talk about, we're telling stories with pictures and words. And, he never considered himself the person who would only arrive on the scene after the words were already written, And so it's like we are telling the story with a dual stream.
Right.
And those who prefer words will get the story through the words. And those who communicate and understand things visually will get it through visual inputs. And I think that kind of mentality was fresh among publishers at the time. There was like the designers were the people who did the pretty things at the end of the process, whereas they were intricately woven into everything we were doing. And as you say, it was a time of extraordinary invention. And so as we were pioneering, these new media, we wanted designers embedded with the teams right from the start to think about, things like not just what does it look like, but what is the user experience. So our design thinking goes, way, way back. Yeah,
it's again, seminal is the word that comes to mind. Like it was a moment, especially by the time we get to the late 90s, especially right prior to the kind of IPO frenzy that took over some of the more creative pursuits that were being featured in the magazine. And there's something I want to just like touch on here or kind of explore a little bit. I think, in that period of time, we were imagining maybe a little techno utopia mentality about how things were going, but we were really imagining okay, guilty as charged. We were really imagining, that these technologies were going to liberate people in some really significant ways. And, sitting here some 20 plus years later, it's clear that while technologies brought a lot of gifts, and I specifically mean interactive technology, computer technology, data, et cetera, it's also brought us a real large number of social ills, all the way from inaccurate or not truthful news to flat out manipulation and lying, and siloization of people and their thinking habits and the way they perceive the world. Certainly not the world we were imagining in that period of time. Just walk me through your thinking a little bit of where you went from at that point where we were involved in like imagining what might be a better future for humanity to today. And what are some of the things that you think were important that didn't have it turn out to necessarily be better for humanity? And I'll leave it to historians to maybe determine exactly what was, but from a kind of very in the front row of the experience, what did you see about that, and when did you see it really start to change, and then where are we now?
That's such a big question. I hope we could spend the entirety of our time together on this one thing, because obviously I have been thinking about it, for 25 or 30 years, as the case may be, and it is alarming. I mean, we, on balance, tend to look for disaster as humans. It is an evolutionary trait that has served us well. If we are scouring the horizon, analyzing potential threats, then we are far better prepared to dodge them or defeat them, as the case may be. As a journalist, I know that it's journalism's job to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And so when a new technology comes out, and all the investors and the entrepreneurs are all rah-rah about what it's going to do, a typical journalistic response to that is skepticism. Yeah, prove it, right? I don't believe that, and here's how it could all go wrong, and have you thought of that, and so forth. We've just published a story last week, in fact, where because we were asking very pointed questions, we got the largest private equity company in the country to actually promise to never use Ancestry.com's DNA data to integrate with the other data from the other companies in their portfolio.
Oh, wow. I just read that article. So that's some pretty That's pretty impressive, actually. Journalism making a big impact that way.
Right. So I'm kind of proud of that. They said we're not initially including it as we look at it. And then after we published the piece, they said, we would like to clarify, we will never. It's like, that was big. That was big. So when we are sitting here surrounded by these dreamers with these incredibly powerful tools and the ability to design more tools that can transform human interactions and communication, we're annoyed as hell by the journalists in New York who have no idea what we're talking about, and all they want to do is be skeptical. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they would bring up was the haves and have-nots. Mm-hmm. And to me, it is the key issue. I think the information flows follow on after this key idea of exacerbating the divide between the haves and have-nots. And I've spent a significant part of my career actually involved with organizations that have been working on exactly that issue. And but when they said that, back in the 90s, we're busy saying, no, but you don't understand. We can get world experts can now be available to you, on a computer at the library. You don't have to have an Ivy League education to engage with this person and to understand what they're saying. And, this was before Khan Academy and all the online courses had been developed, but we could see that was where it was going. The way it was going to tear down boundaries and distribute information. As each subsequent era of development has progressed, the idea that you don't have access to this basic information becomes, okay, now you don't have access to this more rarefied information, or, now we're complaining about the fact that you have to pay for scientific paper, right? Scientific publishing. But we're losing sight of the fact that nevertheless, anybody can go on Khan Academy, and learn anything they want, and use that. They can learn business skills, they can learn technical skills, all the rest of it, and in many cases for free. So that is true. And we can't lose sight of that. We can't lose sight of the fact that, 150,000 people a day climb out of, extreme poverty. And the world is getting better. There is no question about it, which means that we can elevate our concerns, to more rarefied things. Having said that, what we did not anticipate was the rise of these monopolies and techopolies, and the extent to which they would shape and control our thinking. The corrupting influence of money will work its way into any human endeavor. Just like sex is the thing that drives, early adoption, money is the thing that corrupts human endeavors. It motivates people to do extraordinary things. And it motivates people to be extremely greedy and dishonest. And so, this is the question of the box cutter. Is the box cutter a useful thing that allows us to do X, Y, and Z? Or is it a tool to hijack a plane or kill people or whatever? It's not the tool itself; it's how human beings' own nature uses that tool for good and for evil. So, I'm still hopeful that, the balance of good and evil in the world hasn't been tipped in a particular direction. And that, for every impulse, some corporate entity or nefarious individual or just somebody who's sick or ill, there's a corresponding, positive power that can counteract that. And so I think, that reality still pertains. And meanwhile, people are getting smarter. They are getting more sophisticated. And we are beginning to understand how our tools shape us, on every level, how they shape not just our workflow. I remember my son was taking art classes from this fantastic teacher in Amsterdam. And we would come and go every year. And so each year we would come back a year later and she would work with him again. And, she loved his creativity. And when he was about 8, he started playing video games. And she noticed it in his art. She said his art got smaller. And it was because the screen had become his new reality. And so his art was a reflection of that. We can look at the brain. We can look at brain scans, and we can see how the technology that we use, is changing our brains. And on and on. It's changing the way we design. It's changing our social structures. It's changing our entire civic, process. So, I'm sorry, what was the question?
No. It's because we're looking at like how things, like, I think from the kind of futurist utopia view that we had in the late 90s, how did things get off the rails? But maybe in a clear sense, what you're saying is that it never was on rails to some kind of idealized world for humanity. It went the way human things go, that, sex gets involved and money gets involved and monopoly gets involved. I mean, honestly, the techopolies, as you call them, they were masterful at avoiding regulation in ways that other industries have never escaped. And still to this, I mean, even think about the rise of Uber, where they just ignored regulation and they were able to run roughshod over things. It's kind of really interesting. And I think part of it was the love affair with technology that at least the Americans were having at that time, that kind of created a gap for some of what turned out to be not completely beneficial behavior for human beings, beneficial for those companies, but not necessarily beneficial for human beings.
I think that the technology itself is ingenious, and the regulators don't understand it.
Yeah.
So, I think that we have seen this in the past, whether it was railroads or or other energy sources or what have you. The lag time between the innovation itself and when the regulators catch up with it. The bottom line is everybody was busy making a lot of money and nobody wanted to slow that down. And, even at Wired, we were very much champions of, let technology do what it's going to do, because it's going to lift all boats. And, we famously published John Barlow's essay on, Wine Without Bottles, about intellectual property and, the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, which is, we come before you, citizens of a new planet called cyberspace. And, you terrestrial beings are not equipped to, impose your laws on us, because this is a whole new realm. And, while that is true, and it required fresh thinking about things, and still requires fresh thinking, and will always require fresh thinking, because this technology innovation cycle will continue on, hopefully forever, because if it stops, it's because there are no more humans. Yeah. And yet, we do have to, the regulators come up behind and try and carve out protections.
Yeah, and I think, I want to make sure that for our listeners right now, I'm not saying that regulation in the typical political sense is what I would say is missing. I think it's almost like, you were saying in Wired, you had your designers working with your writers. What I think there's a function that we were missing in a way, which was those who think holistically and systems wise. And I'm not saying there wasn't people back there doing that, but it just seemed like we were running so fast and inventing so fast and creating so fast that maybe those people that had that more systems view, or more the ability to do, not the thesis of what's going to be great, but the antithesis of what could go wrong, or how things could become weaponized, or how if you mix this radical technology with kind of unfettered capitalism, you might get this. And the reason I bring it up is that, especially with your work now with Neo-Life, the fundamental risk at really changing our bodies and our DNA and our way our brains function is if we get that one wrong in some fundamental ways, then we have existential crisis. In fact, we have weaponization of many of these technologies that could lead us to existential crisis for humanity. So as we're ramping into this next section, I think possibly also, Jane, I want to just say, could come with age and wisdom versus, you go back to us, some 25 years ago, there was just youthful exuberance, which was great. How do we look forward in two kinds of guises? How do we look forward with the ability to have that exuberance and excitement about the invention of newness, but also the sobriety to be responsible for that which we're inventing, and that we can analyze the environment which we're turning these things loose in. I mean, we turned technology loose into a kind of newly emerging investment and capitalist world that allowed for this explosive growth of these companies. It was unheralded at that point, unheard of and unheralded. And so here we are. And I don't think that's ever stopped. I think actually it's just accelerating. Where is this space? I guess the thing I'm looking for is, where is the space for what is a benevolent future for humankind, and how do we begin to have both the enthusiasm about the future and some kind of shaping sense or regulation sense, or a function called regulating it so that human beings might survive the next era and thrive. That's the itch that I'm wanting to scratch, and doing it with you. We can do it a little bit looking back and then looking forward. You're right in the middle of that. What is that? What is that like in those conversations with people who are messing with some fundamental blocks of being a human being?
Well, I think it's fascinating for me. I mean, I feel like I'm doing, the work I was meant to do, and that I'm almost in a unique position. There aren't that many people who have the benefit of seeing the digital revolution, but also looking at what's happening in the life sciences, and how, I essentially think of what's happening now is the next stage of the digital revolution, right? Because the digital revolution was really about transforming the way we do work and the way we educate our kids and the way we participate in civic society, our communication, our entertainment, right? It was all our structures, basically. And that kind of played out. I mean, my son is 20, he's going to be 25. He just turned 24, sorry. And, he essentially grew up with screens, his whole life. And it's had, a sort of predictable trajectory that I see played out in my kids. So that's kind of, in a sense, done. That first 25-year cycle is now kind of complete. And, the next phase is this technological revolution going inside our bodies, right? And so it's changing. It starts with things like, ocular implants, or, I went to basically a body hacking conference, and we're on our way to dinner, and everybody's like, I'm a cyborg, how many implants do you have? And I was like, well, actually I have an IUD, and I've got a pin in my knee, and I've got, whatever. And they're like, yeah, you're a cyborg. And I was like, I never thought of it that way. I have this prosthetic device, that I use to make phone calls, but it's also a cognitive enhancement tool. So I think it's interesting to look at the trajectory. I think it's also interesting to look at the technologies that we're talking about. Back in 1989, we were talking about the desktop publishing revolution, and the big risk there was that you would create ugly documents. I mean, this is fundamentally different. What we're looking at now are technologies that transform entire species. If we're talking about a gene drive, that could completely disrupt entire ecosystems, right? If you want to prevent a mosquito from carrying malaria, and you do something that can be transmitted not just during that population's life cycle, but to all subsequent offspring of that particular bug, now you're impacting the birds and the bees and, everything else. So, we can look back at the kind of regulation that we were able to stave off in the early days of the digital revolution. But life science has always had this, they've always had this concern about moving forward and checking, and if you look at how the nuclear program happened, it's, Edward Teller, the Manhattan Project, that happened, and they immediately realized what they had on their hands. And a whole subset of scientists then devoted the rest of their careers, and that work continues in trying to protect humanity from the negative impacts of nuclear energy and nuclear power. And then, of course, now there's a whole group of people who are very pro, nuclear power for just kind of the same reasons, but with opposite arguments. So if you look back, I mean, 1970 something, 1972, 73, Asilomar was the seat of one of the first gatherings of scientists who were concerned about the use of recombinant DNA. Fast forward to whatever it must have been, let's say 2013 was the first time CRISPR-Cas9, I believe, was used for human gene editing. Now, of course, this is just human cells. This isn't in actual humans. This is all lab work. There was an immediate understanding of what could happen, and a group of concerned scientists who gathered together to say, how are we going to prevent this technology from disrupting our entire species? And so there was a collaborative, very open and honest exchange of opinions, and the world scientific community agreed we should not move forward with human gene editing using CRISPR-Cas9. That we can continue the research, but that we have to put a moratorium on the use of this in human cells. But there's always incentives, and this didn't reach the level of official regulation, but it was an agreed upon moratorium by all the world scientists working in that space. And then we have He Jiankui, who for reasons of personal glory and perhaps economic opportunity, or perhaps, who knows, political manipulation, right? I mean, maybe he was sent out by the Chinese government or set up by the Chinese government to do exactly what he did, right, so that the Chinese could actually witness what the world's response would be. And then they could throw him under the bus if it made them look bad. So there's that kind of theory. So it's to me, I consider it, just another one of those checks and balances.
Yeah, well, and I think the thing that's what gets uncovered, especially we talk about gene editing of our potential offspring, and I think it's a great topic because it unveils a lot of the other ethical dilemmas for humanity in general. You start about, you're talking about being a cyborg or a transhuman or a post-human, all these kinds of ideas. The piece that maybe we've been struggling with since the Plato's Academy is, what is a good human life, and what does a good human society look like? And certainly you can look at these technologies as really great test cases for, well, what are the ethics of this? Obviously, hey, look, if I could edit genes and have people not suffer for some really radically debilitating genetic disorders, wouldn't that be great? Well, most people would say, yes, that would be great. And then you say, well, if I could change my child's skin color or eye color, would that be great? Most people are like, no, that's probably not great, which is a very simplistic view of this. But it illuminates for me that we can't just do technology on basic, simple ethics cases, that we actually require much more. You were talking about the mosquitoes. If you don't understand the ecosystems these developments are going into, you could destroy an ecosystem. And destroying an ecosystem could have a chain reaction called no more life on the planet. But and even to have a capacity to imagine that gives us the capacity, because we're human beings, we can imagine really a lot of things, gives us a capacity to imagine how these impacts might carry out, not just upon our children, but generations down the line. And in fact, I want to ask you this question because it's occurred to me. Are we, in this moment, does it seem like to you that there are a lot more people asking really long-term questions about humanity than there was, 25 years ago when we were in this other very futuristic conversation? Because to me, it seems like we're all talking about multi-generational impacts, 100-year impacts, crazy ideas like 10,000 years from now. How is that over there where you are?
Well, I mean, being right in the middle of Silicon Valley, it's, loud. It's a loud conversation. And, the thing that's exciting to me, I mean, it is the technology itself is fundamentally different from many kinds of technologies that we have developed before. And, the internet networking in general has given us, this kind of sense of what we can collectively do. We're talking about, geothermal energy, we're talking about colonizing space, we're talking about engineering the human genome, so it's like we would never have been able to do this without the digital technologies that have been developed in the last 50, 60 years. So what's interesting to me is that the voices saying, yeah, but hang on, is that good for humans, are now being listened to. And, in the past, it's because they didn't have the technological capability to understand what was going on. And we didn't necessarily have a broad enough understanding in society of where things could go wrong. And so I feel like this, the last 25 years has done a really good job of preparing us for our future. We see what happens thanks to the pandemic when the entire world, comes together to focus on one problem, and I don't know if you were speaking like in the last year or the last 5 years or whatever, but there's a number of signposts along the way, like Tristan Harris leaving Google and, the Facebook, and sort of recognizing that moment, that class, that taught those engineers what stickiness was on a website, how to get people to come back and spend more time. It was like, from that moment forward, I think there's, and having, venture capitalists and investors say, yes, you're right, this is a problem, and we need to pay attention to that. I mean, this actually, now that I think about it, it goes back to an essay that Bill Joy wrote for Wired in, I believe it was the year 2000, where he basically worried about, essentially the singularity. Like if we continue developing, artificial intelligence at the rate that we are currently doing so, it becomes apparent that we will arrive at a point at which, we can no longer track or even understand the artificial intelligences that we develop. And, what do we do then? And how do we, like that scene in the Terminator, how do we have John Connor, come back from the future and prevent that one scientist from doing that one thing, that will prevent the robots from taking over? We've been thinking about this for a long time. And what's exciting to me is that the conversation is changing. And, not that there's much good to say about coronavirus, but, when all is said and done, if that's all it took to wake us up to our potential as like one species, one planet, to work together, to focus on one thing and design solutions, then maybe all of this horrible sacrifice will have been worth it.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, it's certainly pattern interrupt, right? The capacity to, especially I think our modern life, especially as tied to technology, has been a very fast-paced life. Not any structured time to sit around and think about things, because we can work 24 hours a day and be productive, really super highly effective at midnight. Versus,
and if we're not, we could take modafinil, which is what the drug they give fighter pilots to like stay awake.
Just keep going, right? I mean, our parents' generation, working at midnight would have literally, unless you had a graveyard shift at a diner, there was no working at midnight.
Right.
There wasn't even an opportunity. Versus now we can work 24 hours a day. I think the pattern interrupt of actually like just being forced to slow down has caused a lot of that. Because then when patterns get interrupted, we have to find, a new stasis, a new place to ground ourselves. And that requires some thinking. I want to go back to something you said. You brought up Terminator. And this is a hypothesis I have that basically for most human beings on the planet right now, we have two futures. Either the AI robots are going to get us, or the zombies are going to get us. So it's either going to be a computer catastrophe, or it's going to be a biosciences catastrophe that takes us out. And in general, and mostly because dark stories tend to sell much better than the opposite kind, we live in a world of potential dystopia, at least in our imagination, kind of as a constant threat. And I think even at the beginning of the conversation, you said we're always hyper vigilant about these threats, and that orients our looking and our kind of desire to criticize is where we started. But like you've been in this a long time. As you look forward to grandchildren's age, great-grandchildren's age, I don't think either one of us can begin to anticipate the technological world that might take place 100 years from now. But that being said, we can begin to imagine what we think would be a good world for them to inhabit. And I think given the access you have to some of the scientists and people that you're working with, do you see that as part of what's emerging right now? Is this desire to think about, imagine, and then work on from our limited tools to impact the future that far down the line? As a project for humanity, that we actually are interested in generating something that's different than the zombies or the AI from ending the world for human beings.
Mm. Yeah, we think a lot about this. We have this motto at Wired that change is good, and I think people are terrified by change, and for good reason. It's the unknown. So what could go wrong? What could possibly go wrong? Well, a lot could possibly go wrong. I think about what can go right. And, I feel like it's our job at Neolife to find those things that look like positive outcomes, or look like they could lead us to positive outcomes, and kind of highlight those in a sort of curated way. What would we like to see happen? I was thinking about these two companies. I often use them as examples. One is called Mango Materials, and they basically use methane gas, and through a process of fermentation, can transform that into biopolymers, which can then be used to create bioplastics, which could replace the plastics that are currently clogging our ecosystem. And then, of course, they break down and decompose and become carbon that then become methane gas that then fuels the rest of it. There's a company called Novo Nutrients, and they use industrial gas like CO2 as basically a foodstuff to create industrial food products, so fish meal and things like that. And of course, again, when that breaks down, it creates more carbon, so that creates more, these like closed loop, cradle to cradle kind of solutions are at our fingertips,
right.
And it's like they're right there, and people are working on that, and that will transform a lot of things, right? A lot of people are going to be out of jobs because plastics have, created so much, plastics, packaging, all of that thing, hugely disruptive, and yet clearly the direction we need to be heading in. Right? You could talk about engineering nature. I was at this really interesting conversation at the TED conference when there was a cloud scientist, up on stage, and they're trying to understand the role of clouds on terrestrial greenhouse gases, and the idea was, should we be doing geoengineering in a way that could impact the clouds? And, Al Gore was sitting in the audience, and he goes, I, for one, don't want to use, planet Earth as a giant experiment, to figure out about that. And it's like, wait, but that is exactly what we're doing. All day, every day, humanity are doing things on our planet, with our energy sources, with our own bodies, with our agriculture, which are experiments. And so what would we like to see happen? And, there's tremendous risk in moving science forward, particularly when it comes to things like gene editing, tremendous risk. But if we don't try, we'll never know. And so how do you move the science forward in a way that you quickly understand what's working and what's not, so that you can minimize the risk? And there will be sacrifices. Humans will die, families will suffer. But in the long run, how many families will suffer to unlock how much health, or how much clean environment, or how much clean energy? So, what I get excited about is just diversifying, just creating more opportunities, and then we have choices, and then it becomes a market issue, and whether something succeeds in the market or not is a sustainability issue just as much as environmental sustainability is an issue. And and when you get the two together, then you have a way forward. And the only way to get the two together is just to have a plethora of options. But a lot of people making a lot of different bets on a lot of different types of technology and science.
Yeah, and I just of course, with the biosciences, we already have bioethics. We have a we have a tradition. You're talking about recombinant DNA reaching back into the 1970s and begin this conversation. It seems that, like at Wired going, it seems like we need this, we need a whole generation of ethicists to come along with this, the ability to really see clearly into these human choices. I don't remember many ethical conversations going on in the late 90s. We thought everything was good. That was the basic stance. Everything is going to turn into this amazing democratized world where a child in India can have as much, information and expertise. And that's true. And it is true today. And honestly, a lot of our work at Boldly Now is how do we create, tools that allow people to upgrade themselves, become purposeful, get out there and make an impact. And
Right.
we think a lot about the child in India. Again, it's still important that we do that. And when we're dealing with entrepreneurs that are building new businesses or even nonprofits, we do now ask them the question of to take a moment and think about how your project could be used to nefarious ends, or not even nefarious, but just accidental blowback, that you unleash something that maybe you should have thought about before you unleashed. And so there's a maturity, I think, that's happening in this. And I think we've now spent a lot of our focus on getting young people into STEM programs. Maybe we need to get some young people into philosophy programs and ethics programs as well, and have this kind of co-evolutionary force.
So that's exactly what I'm thinking, is that we cannot separate those.
Yeah.
Those are not two different tracks.
No.
So I had a really interesting conversation with a woman named Greg Renfrew, and she runs a company called Beauty Counter.
Mm-hmm.
And Beauty Counter's goal is to produce cosmetics that are not full of chemicals of dubious origin and impact, both on human health as well as the environment. And she told me something, and I wish I could remember the exact details of it, but she basically said that the FDA had not outlawed a new chemical in 50 years, and that there had been like 18,000 new chemicals designed, over that period of time. And that's really interesting. So I think we need to, my suggestion to her was, she wanted to focus on the regulation. And I said, what if you actually focused on getting a university curriculum changed so that you cannot graduate with a degree in chemistry without having had to take classes in ethics, to understand the impacts that the work you're doing has. So I think we need to embed ethics into everything we're doing. And then that's why so that's one point. The second point I would make is that the idea that we are all very narrowly focused and we become experts and we go deeper and deeper and deeper into our fields as our careers advance, it's fine. And I think there's a lot of people who will thrive in that, and who will also provide tremendous value to society in that specialization. But I think the great leaps forward come from those who are able to take a step back and look outside of their domain laterally at other comparable domains. So the geneticist who undertakes to understand nutrition, or the microbiologist who studies the brain, that's when we start to get the complexity of these different systems talking to each other. And, the vagus nerve connects the gut to the brain, and it's like a superhighway. And it could be that bacteria in our gut are what's actually triggering things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, right? And certainly, irritable bowel syndrome and other things like that. So, I think we need to become more interdisciplinary. And, I'm encouraged by my friends who are teaching at college level and postgraduate levels, saying that they cannot get over how smart the kids are that are coming into their classrooms, how much they know, how much further they are than they were when they walked in 25 years earlier or whatever. And the fact is, we have, because of the digital revolution, because of our technology, these kids grow up learning everything is an input for them. They have the entire world at their feet. Okay, so they learned about sex from nasty porn on the internet. I'm sorry, and that's a big issue that I would love to talk about some other day. But at the same time, I mean, my kids were playing, Sim City and Railroad Tycoon and all these other simulation games that help them understand, how cities are built and the right values to bring to create the outcomes you're looking for, or how businesses work and what the compromises are and how the choices you make influence the outcomes. So, so I think we're better equipped. It sounds impossible to say, oh, well, you need to understand computer science and, the genome, but we have people who are capable of doing that.
Yeah.
And there's one other point that I wanted to make at the risk of going on too long, that as media creators, there's a book about this, which I would recommend. And that is Juan Enrique, who's done TED Talks that are viewed by millions of people. He's a dear friend and a constant inspiration. He's been writing about this concept of Homo evolutus, like our ability to evolve ourselves, for 20 years now. He invented the phrase bioeconomy. He's been at Harvard for a long time, but his latest book is called Right, Wrong, How Technology Transforms Our Ethics. And it's a really important read right now because, you were saying, how could we even envision today what our great-grandchildren's choices will be and what choices we've made today, how they will impact them? Well, Juan does exactly that. He looks forward to the day when, my great-granddaughter, comes to me and explains that, she had a child with another woman and they both used their own DNA to create it. This whole concept of the artificial gamete, or a trans man or a trans woman, gave birth, or whatever these crazy, reproductive technologies will enable us to do. And, by the same token, we can't use our 2021 ethics to judge, people 200 years ago. We can try. I've been watching Outlander. I don't know if you're binging Netflix series, but I certainly am. I finally found Outlander, and this woman is a time traveler. And, so she comes back to colonial America and is just hysterical about slavery, and almost gets herself and her husband killed because of it. But anyway, the point being, I think we need to integrate the ethics. I think we're at a better point now than maybe in the whole 30 years since I've been involved in this industry, to do so, to pay attention to the ethicists and to have them integrated, like the designers have been integrated. It used to be the engineers would do something and toss it over the wall, to the marketing people. And then they embedded the marketers with the engineers so that they could do it together, embed the designers with the marketers, with the engineers, embed the ethicists with the designers, with the marketers, with the engineers, and we have the tools. We have Slack, we have Zoom, we have, the tools to actually make that happen.
Yeah, I think we have the capacity. We just need to have the will. And even by the fact that we're having this conversation, Jane, right now, and having our networks of conversations outside of this, it's the emergent will. I mean, it is a conversation that's present. Obviously, we're doing what we can to forward that conversation, but it's already present. And I think the thing I've learned more about creativity and the emergence of new ideas in the world is that it's simultaneous and it's multiplicative. It's all over the place. We are being used by this idea as much as we're using this idea to forward some aim and some end. And I can actually remember reading, I can't remember who wrote the first articles about memetics in Wired, like that, like the ideas the idea that ideas travel, that they have these kind of viral qualities, and not the memes that the kids kick around these days, but this is the real notion of that. And, so we're being used by something that seems really powerful and important. And then we're using that to forward some larger aims. Definitely want to get you to introduce us to Juan and have him on the show to have a bigger conversation about this.
Yeah. Yes, he's wonderful.
Last question for you here. As you look out into that future, you said great or great-grandchildren, how do you feel? What's your overall, do you feel dis-ease about that? Do you feel excitement? What is that future for you at this point in your life?
When I first got involved with Neolife, or the ideas that drove me to create Neolife. It was with just flat, bald-faced, excitement, optimism, and so forth. And I was already involved in this world when the first scientists genetically engineered those twins in China, and I can also see again the story we published last week about a private equity firm that now owns 18 million genomes from Americans. Actually, they're in 30 countries. So there is some disease in the sense that there will be acts of bioterror, and there will be acts of bioerror. And I think that we would be naive to think otherwise. There will be monopolies. There will be technologies that transform us in ways that many, if not most people, would agree are not good. And on the other side, we can eliminate genetically inherited diseases. We can prevent the diseases of aging. We can create a far more nutritious agricultural product that uses less land, less water, less fertilizer, and less pesticides. We can feed whatever population level we want to, on this planet with resources we currently have and technologies we currently understand. I think those are pretty great things.
Yeah.
We will tinker with the genes that will make our species better adapted to life in space. And that will create a new race of humans. I believe this. Time frame, unclear. Probably not my great-grandchildren, probably further out than that. But we already know there's a scientist, a brilliant man and a wonderful humanitarian named George Church at Harvard, who back in 2015, maybe it's 2013, but I think it was 2015, 2017. I'm a little fuzzy on he edited 60 different genes in a pig. So the pig suffers from something called PERV, porcine, retrovirus infections. But he edited 60 genes that prevented the pig from developing this disease, which would allow us to use pigs to incubate human organs. Mm-hmm. So the idea that, you no longer die for lack of a liver or a kidney, we'll just grow it in this pig. But perhaps then we create pigs that are part human, and like hideous ideas. There's so many hideous ideas at the forefront of the neobiological revolution, and hideous outcomes that, you could spend your whole life thinking about that and writing horror novels about that. But on the other hand, the idea of having multiple species is really exciting, and maybe ultimately is an evolutionary adaptation that kind of future-proofs, some of Homo sapien DNA, because something could happen that Homo sapiens as currently configured can't adapt to, and we'd be wiped out were it not for the fact that we started tinkering with these other aspects of our genome. So ultimately, I'm an optimist. I think there'll be a balance, though. I think it will come with some costs and some compromises. But whoever said we were the end of evolution? Whoever said we were the last, ultimate, and final, act of creation? Even evolution evolves. And if the planet becomes too hot to support Homo sapiens, maybe some new race of, Homo sapien derived or cyborg enhanced, creature roams this planet. And I just hope that when that happens, we get better at interacting with them than we have been at interacting with people whose DNA is different from ours by a tiny, tiny infinitesimal piece.
Yeah, that the biological revolution has to be matched with a cultural revolution that's, that includes redesign of society. Obviously, we have the capacity to have, equal access, but culturally we don't do it. We have the capacity to feed everybody, but by some set of market forces combined with political forces, we don't. And so there's a lot to be said about upgrading, the software of humanity, the way that we interact with one another, more love and more compassion. We kind of all know that more love, compassion, tolerance, resilience, we all know these are beautiful values and characteristics, and yet the evolution towards them is not linear. It definitely has some twists and turns. I agree.
It's just accelerated.
Yeah. Well, certainly everything's accelerated, and that's pretty proven out across multiple domains. I agree with you. I'm an incurable optimist about these things. I still feel like I did in the late '90s, first making films and commercials, and that kind of the feeling like we could redesign the way that we interact with each other. I still feel that. I think what I feel that's different now is I want to do it not as God creator, wonderkind kind of person, but as a deeply listening, deeply empathetic and sensitive creator that is creating into a ecosystem and a world that can benefit from everything that we're doing and can be harmed, so that we should, not that we don't move quick when it's time to move quick, but that we are thoughtful. When we were in our conversation, I just so feel that it's like a underlying thread of being that's in the conversation that leaves me feeling like, okay, we've got all the resources we need in human beings. They're over there with Jane there. You spoke about Juan. They're out there. And part of what I know you're doing with Neolife, what we're doing with Boldly Now, is knitting some of those conversations together, giving them bigger platforms, making sure that everybody has access to this good and more complete, holistic, systems-oriented thinking. So I agree with you on the optimistic side. Jane, I just want to say I'm so appreciative of the work that you do. Appreciative of this conversation for sure, and I hope we get to keep having these conversations about the future and how we might generate a better one. But really appreciate the fact that you have made this amazing career where you have continually explored the things that are in your interest and your passion, but have also illuminated for us so many things. I want to make sure everybody that's listening or watching the show, be sure and go check out Neolife, neo.life. You guys have a book that's a compilation of essays and short fiction and things like that really illuminate this new area. And of course, there's tons of resources and articles and things that are being published in that digital publication that are very, very valuable. If you have any interest, I want to say, if you have any interest, go to Neolife. That it's not like a technical journal where you're going to have a PhD in chemistry or biology or something like that to understand it. It's really written so that the average reader can dig in there and learn things and get their life enriched and opened up to this revolution that's going on around us. To some might be really terrifying, to others really exciting, but really an important conversation to have in the world. So thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that. And, it is our responsibility to understand how these technologies are going to transform us. We will be asked to weigh in on this. And it is important that we educate ourselves. Just as the revolution was like a giant steamroller that rolled over anybody that didn't want to participate or could not participate, the same thing is coming true. And, the scientists do not want to be left alone with the ethical decisions that have to be made now. So we have to step up as citizens and do some of the hard work to understand what's going on. And selfishly, I will just say Neolife is an easy way to learn some of this stuff. Yeah. It's more about being familiar with the issues than it is, grappling with molecular biophysics or chemistry. So yeah, thank you for that. And it's, by the way, it's not neolife.com. It's www.neo.life, because .life is a domain name.
I know we get it with the ly all the time. People put bold.ly.com. Like, no, it's not going to get you there. Yeah. It's funny because we all grew up in the .com world. Right now we're in the all kinds of things world. So
anything goes world.
Neo.life, neo.life. Go check it out for sure. Jane, it's been a pure joy and pleasure. I look forward to our next conversation. Keep us informed, especially as these new things come up. We want to keep talking about it with our audience and keeping us kind of in between two worlds, predicting the future and generating a future, we want to be able to understand what's predictable and what we might declare that we want to have happen. Those of us who have the wherewithal to imagine a better place for humanity and a thriving future for humanity. So thank you, Jane, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Michael Sean.
The Boldly Now Show, igniting the world of burning desire, big ideas, and bold action. Be sure to download Boldly You in the App Store, Google Play, or online at bold.ly/YOU. Boldly You is an app and learning platform igniting your burning desire, big ideas, and bold action, generating a future for a thriving humanity. Boldly Now is an initiative of the Generative Futures Initiative, generating a thriving future for humanity. Learn more at generativefuturesinitiative.com.